Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Good to have you here for the warm-up to a wonderful forum. We're delighted to have Ann Reed with us. I'm Tim Hart Anderson, the moderator of the forum and pastor here at Westminster Presbyterian Church, and we're glad you're here. And if you're joining us via the live stream, glad you're here as well. We'll think of ourselves as one big audience. Ann is a Minnesota native, began playing guitar at a very young age and has been playing it ever since then. She's a songwriter, a solo performer, and has toured all over our country, coast to coast, has appeared on ABC's Good Morning America and NPR's Morning Edition. She has received numerous accolades, including Minnesota Music Academy Performer of the Year, Songwriter of the Year, and Best Recording of the Year. Please join me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Ann Reed.
Thank you. If my heart fails to break at the sight of incredible pain in this tired old world, this crazy time is having its way. If my mind understands every ruthless and poisonous act in this tired old world, this crazy time is having its way. To love and to comfort has meaning I never had known. Some people fighting their way through this life all alone. If I cannot feel something for anyone's struggles it tells, I've lost my compassion and mercy as well as myself. If my eyes turn away just because I've had enough for one day, then this tired old world, this crazy time is having its way. If my life on from here is a life lived and driven by fear, then this tired old world, this crazy time is having its way. If I ever get to a time when it don't bother me to bury my friends or watch somebody die on the street, if I don't feel much more than disgust or a shrug or a well, then I've lost my compassion and mercy as well as myself. If my heart fails to break at the sight of incredible pain in this tired old world, this crazy time is having its way. This tired old world, this crazy time is having its way. This tired old world, this crazy time is having its way. Well, it's so lovely to be in this beautiful space with all of you, and I think I have to sing a Minnesota song. This is a song that I wrote, too many years ago. But it came from, because I went to college for 1 year. It was all the longer I could stand it, and they really didn't want me there anyway. So I would go to Bemidji State, and it used to be Bemidji State College. It's now Bemidji State University, because at one point they added a McDonald's and a Holiday Inn, and but I would pass this place called Hole in the Day, and there was Hole in the Day Lake, and there was Hole in the Day Drive, and I found out that there was an Ojibwe chief named Hole in the Day, and that's who it is named after. He was named Hole in the Day because he was born on the solar eclipse, and has nothing whatever to do with this song, but There's a hole in the day, the light peeking through, and I'm on familiar ground. Colors all say, don't we know you? And how come you ain't been around? And I've been too far too long. I figured it out on my own. It's now in my sight. Dorothy was right. It's true, there is no place like home. There's a hole in the day, the trees are on fire. They're burning but not consumed. They're finding a way brighter, higher and higher. Tonight they will color the moon. And I've been too far too long. I figured it out on my own. It's now in my sight. Dorothy was right. It's true, there is no place like home. Pine trees sway and whisper, oh, welcome home. Back trails wind and twist, you're almost to the main road. There's a hole in the day where spirits arrive to dance on the rolling waves. It's to and away they leap and they fly and go back through the hole in the day. And I've been too far too long. I figured it out on my own. It's now in my sight. Dorothy was right. It's true, there is no place like home. It's now in my sight. Dorothy was right. It's true, there is no place like home. Thank you. Well, I live in the Longfellow, Hiawatha Howe neighborhood, and our neighborhood has not come back in the past couple of years. We're still struggling, and still a lot of people are. And so I wrote this 2 years ago, in June of 2020. So. Listen, can we stop just a minute? Open our hearts and let a little bit in. It's impossible. We can't stop explaining truth. There's no way we know it about the pain. And no, we keep talking. So many shoes we never walking on. Listen, you can hear the other voices trying to break through all the everlasting noise. It's impossible. We can't hear a word if we're busy. Chatter, every righteous thing we heard. No, we keep talking. So many shoes we never walking. No, we keep talking. So many shoes we never walking on. Listen, when a person tells a story, open our hearts for the whole offertory. It's possible we might start to get it, maybe take a hold if only we can let it. But no, we keep talking. So many shoes we never walking. No, We keep talking, so many shoes we never walking. Well, now I have something very practical for you because I know that you're all going to learn a lot tonight from the guest speakers and stuff. But I wanted to throw mine in there too. I wanted to give you something practical to do. We're coming up on a couple of holidays here, Memorial Day and July 4th holiday, where you're going to have to be with your families, and where you get to be with your families. And really, lately, because everybody's so divided and it's just so fractured, sometimes it's kind of hard to be with your family. Sometimes you have somebody in the family, the politics are not, quite in line with yours, which means they're wrong. And and so I have this in case you are at a picnic or something, and somebody's starting to get into it. You can just tell them. And I think this is very interesting, especially if you have English majors in your family. Just remind them and try to distract them with this. Tell them, hey, did you know that you can sing a lot of Emily Dickinson's poems to the tune of the Yellow Rose of Texas? Did you know that? Because everybody will stop and go, what are you talking about? And of course you will be able to say, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, we knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. And you can do that so easily. So, but what happens? What happens if perhaps, not only do your politics not agree, but perhaps they don't like your politics and they don't like Emily Dickinson? Well, what we have then is you go to Robert Frost. That's all you can do. So now I know you know this song, and I hope you'll join me. It's to the tune of Hernando's Hideaway. Yes, it's stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods are these? I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. See, you're not going to be able to look at that poem the same anymore, that's for sure. So. I have a song here for everybody who's ever felt like a square peg. What they were thinking, what are we to do with you? They dressed me up, they dressed me down. A teacher told me in the hallway after school, you're so square and the world's so round. I'd like to tell her I'm all right. I'm all right. my kith and kin. And then I sing out, I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm out walking in the same sunlight as you. Oh, sing it out for no one else. Sing it loud, convince myself I'm all right. A miracle, I'm even standing here today. A firm foundation neath my shoes. Remember words the bard had scribbled in his play. To thine own self, yeah, you be true. And then we all sing, I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm out walking in the same sunlight as you. I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm out walking in the same sunlight as you. Good. This is a song that I wrote. I wrote for the sesquicentennial year of First Universalist Church in Minneapolis. That was back in 2008, and then the other church that I sing at often, St. Joan of Arc, they kind of stole the song, and now they sing it too. So that's kind of nice for me. So she wrote it for us. No, she didn't. It's a long road we've set our feet upon. A long road we've set our feet upon. And with loving hearts we walk on. Loving hearts walk on. We will walk on. We will walk on. Bridges are built with open hands. Bridges are built with open hands. And we begin to heal the world. We begin to heal the world. We will heal the world. We will heal the world. We will heal the world. When the sun shines through all of us, there on the road will be a rainbow in front of us. Wherever we go, wherever we go. Take a single flame and pass it on. Take a single flame and pass it on. And it's enough to light the way. It's enough to light the way. We will light the way. We will light the way. when the sun shines through all of us, there on the road, be a rainbow in front of us, wherever we go, wherever we go. All the souls who came before us standing here, all the souls who came before us standing here, you can hear them whisper low, you can hear them whisper low. We will walk with you, we will walk with you, we will light the way, we will light the way, we will heal the world, we will heal the world, we will walk on, we will walk on, we will walk on, we will walk on. So this next song has kind of been my go-to song since 2016. And I just, I just kept thinking, it just can't get any weirder. And then I would wake up and it got weirder. And so. So sad to hear you say, you think the joy in days is done, over and done. So yeah, the news is bad, dark is the path that said some light when it seems there is none. I'm gonna sing in the middle of a great big crowd, gonna do a little dance, gonna live out loud, gonna play with the puppy, gonna ride my bike, make funny faces and love this life. For every hateful word, I'll say 10 loving verbs to mend this tattered flag of mine. So yeah, this ragged piece, within and underneath threads, unbroken and bright. I'm gonna listen to the giggles of the kids next door, gonna give what I got, gonna play this chord, plant my garden, watch it grow and thrive, kneel in the dirt and love this life. Bad old Goliath, he's got 2 big feet, I ain't gonna let him step all over me. Now if you're looking down, you only see the ground and miss the colors of the sky. So yeah, you just might trip. If that's the worst of it, well, lift your head and feast your eyes and glide through the water in a blue canoe, or stand in the glory of a big full moon. Laugh till you cry and treasure the time. Weep at the beauty and love this life. Sing in the middle of a great big crowd, do a little dance, oh, live out loud, play with the puppy and ride your bike, make funny faces and love this life. Thank you. Well, thank you for having me here this evening. It's been a great pleasure and a great honor to be here at Westminster. And during the pandemic, a lot of artists went scrambling there. And so I've been doing a virtual show now for 2 years. And I'm starting my 3rd year with it. And it started on Facebook, and now it's on YouTube. So it's called Anne Reid Live from Somewhere in Her House. And so it's, yeah, so. But we've had a lot of fun with it, and a lot of people joined in. There are people from all over the country, and it's kind of fun to sit with them for an hour and sing some songs and just be together, even if it is kind of, at first I thought, what am I doing? I'm sitting here and I'm staring at a computer. And then I thought, no, I'm not. I'm sitting here singing to people. It's, there's a difference there, so. This is a song that I thought of right away when I was asked to play here. It's a song that's very dear to my heart. It's a hymn, and certainly if you know it, I encourage you to sing it, masked though you are. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my song, thou God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine. Oh, hear my song, thou God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Anne Reid, before you get away, let us thank you one more time for that wonderful music. Greetings and welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, where for more than 40 years, we have invited speakers of conscience to address issues of the day from an ethical perspective. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I serve as the senior minister here at Westminster Presbyterian Church, and I'm the moderator of today's forum with Miles Rapoport and E.J. Dionne. Today's program is co-sponsored by the Minnesota Humanities Center, seated right over here. Thank you, MHC. Good. Minnesota Humanities Center brings people together to share perspectives that advance the vision of a just society, a society that is curious, connected, and compassionate. Learn more about MHC's work to help build civic capacity and promote civic renewal through humanities at mnhum.org. minhum.org. Got it, okay. Thanks to today's media sponsors, MinnPost is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, reader-supported source of Minnesota news. Visit them online at minnpost.com. Thanks as well to Sahan Journal, covering issues affecting Minnesota immigrants and communities of color. Learn more at sahanjournal.com. Thanks as well to Minnesota Public Radio for recording and broadcasting all Westminster Town Hall Forums. In the second half of today's program, our speakers will be taking questions from you, from the audience. Those of you with us in the sanctuary will find a blank question card in the materials you received when you came in. If you would use that, please, to record a question and pass it forward as an usher collects during the Q&A, and we will ask as many as we can. If you're watching online, we are excited to invite you into this space through live stream, and we want to hear your questions as well. If you would, please put them into the chat feature on the video at any point, and we will be monitoring the chat and present as many of those as we can. Following today's presentation, those of us who've had breads and spreads again in the past will have that opportunity after this program in Westminster Hall, located to your right as you exit the sanctuary, breads and spreads, and there's a cash bar in there as well. This program and everything that we do at the Westminster Town Hall Forum is made possible by all of us, supporters of the forum. Donations from individuals are by far the largest source of funding of the forum. In short, the forum doesn't happen without us and without our support. So if you can, please think of what you might give to support the forum. For those of you here in person, there are donation envelopes in your program, and you can drop those off on the way out of the sanctuary on your way to that cash bar and the breads and spreads. Shall I say that again, or you got the message there? If you're watching live stream, you're going to miss out on the breads and spreads and the cash bar, but you can go to westminsterforum.org/donate. Thank you very much. You know, before we go into the recording, I want everybody here to turn around and look at that rose window facing the west. Just spectacular. Wow. You got the best view in the house back there. Isn't that something? That's 1897. Beauty. Okay, now to the business of the evening. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's Westminster Town Hall Forum speakers. E.J. Dionne is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, a professor at Georgetown University, and a visiting professor at Harvard. He's the author of Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. Miles Rapoport is the Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. He formerly served in the Connecticut State Legislature and as Connecticut's Secretary of State. He also served as president of Demos and of Common Cause. They are the co-authors of 100% Democracy, the Case for Universal Civic Voting. In it, they argue for an election process in the United States where every citizen has not only the right to vote, but also the duty to vote, a requirement to participate in our national choices. We're excited to have them here joining the Westminster Town Hall Forum to make the case for universal voting. Please welcome E.J. Dionne and Miles Rapoport.
I love coming to this place. Thank you so much. No, I love coming to this place. As my friend David Brooks said here once, it's a big crowd. They're incredibly smart. They're incredibly thoughtful, and they all buy books, he said when he came here on one of his visits. And, you know, I love coming to Minnesota, one of the most civic places in the Union. And Miles and I have been talking today. Coming to Minnesota and talking about strengthening democracy is like going to the Napa Valley and lecturing people about how good wine is for you. I mean, this is one of the most civic places in the world, or like going to my native Boston and telling people how to be ardent, fanatical sports fans. I mean, Minnesota is a very special place, and Miles and I sort of want to encourage everybody to adopt our system, and this is Miles' idea. I steal ideas from him all the time. As you know, Minnesota is in a very tough race for first place in voter turnout with the state of Colorado. And you're ahead. You're number one. And yeah, go ahead. Give yourselves a hand. And so Miles and I want to tell you, adopt our idea first so Colorado can't pass you up. So if you're not persuaded by us at the end by the merits of our idea, just let your competitive juices kick in to keep Minnesota at the front of the country on this. I do want to thank this church, this great institution. I also want to shout out MinnPost, which has created a model for a kind of great not-for-profit journalism around the country. There's a real crisis, and yeah. There's a real crisis in local journalism, and actually you guys are lucky here in Minnesota because you have strong local journalism of all kinds. There are a lot of communities that are losing their papers, and MinnPost has created a model that a lot of other places in the country are looking at. I also want to thank my friend Miles Rapoport. We've been working on the project that led to this book together for about 3 years, and I love working with Miles. Miles is an inveterate organizer. He's actually the guy who is organizing a group to further this idea in the country. And I always say that when Miles dies and goes to heaven, the first thing he will do is to organize the angels into a union. And I'd love to see what Miles and God negotiating would be like. He also has so much energy that if Europe could tap Miles, they would not have to ever import another drop of Russian oil. So it's been really great to work with him on this. So why did we get to this idea? I want you to think about our current election system as if it were a fancy dinner party, because that is what our election system is right now. You know, with fancy dinner parties, you've got an A list, the people you really want, and a B list. They're the ones you invite when the people on the A list says no, and then a C list, the people really at the bottom of your preferences. That's what our system is like, especially, by the way, in states that don't have election day registration like you do. Where politicians and their consultants spend all of their time focusing on the likely voters, the people who are going to vote, the people on that A list. They're the ones that get the mail. They're the ones that get the messages online, the knocks on the doors, the phone calls. Everybody is always trying to turn out their people on that A list. The B list are people who are registered to vote, perhaps, but almost never participate. And most of the time, those folks get no attention at all from the system. And then God help the people on the C list, who are the citizens who aren't registered to vote. Nobody in the political world talks to them. Now, this has a lot of negative effects. The first is that we all know that people are more likely to do something if somebody asks them to do it. There's a great story, it may be apocryphal, but I still love the story. It said that Tip O'Neill won an election. An old friend of his comes up, the former Speaker of the House, and old friend comes up and says, "Tip, congratulations, you won." And Tip says, "That's great, I assume you voted for me." And she says, "Oh no, I didn't vote for you, Tip." And he looks at her and said, "But you know me all my life, why didn't you vote for me?" And she says, "Well, you never asked." And it's a good lesson to all politicians, but a lot of the folks on the B list and the C list are never asked. The second effect of that is that campaigns spend an awful lot of their time preaching to the converted and trying to get them to turn out. As Miles likes to say, they're campaigns based on enrage to engage. That can work, but it's not necessarily the healthiest way to run a democratic system. The campaigns also spend an awful lot of time trying to keep the A-list voters of the other side, the likely voters of the other side, from voting. And so they get all kinds of negative information, not to persuade them to vote for the other side, but just to have them give up in disgust and stay home. And so this, we think, is a core problem that the requirement that everyone cast a ballot would solve, because suddenly you're telling every single person in the country that your vote matters, that your role in our great democratic experiment matters. And politicians know that everybody, or virtually everybody, except if they are sick on election day or something terrible goes wrong, everybody is going to come out. And that means the politicians have to talk to everybody. There's a model for what we are talking about. There are 25 countries that use the system we propose. In our book, we talk a lot about Australia, partly because that's a country a lot of Americans relate to pretty easily, but mostly because they've been using this system for 100 years. I really sort of tried to make a case for an idea that had a proof of concept 100 years old. If that isn't adequate proof of concept, I don't know what is. And in Australia, as somebody we quote in the book says, elections are like a party. How does the system work? And I'll just close my part with this and kick it over to Miles. Under the Australian system, everyone is, the government plays a big role in making sure everyone is registered to vote. You're required to register to make sure you're registered. So 96% of Australians are registered to vote, and 90% of those voters, or those registered people, cast ballots on election day. If you don't vote, you get a little notice from the government that says, notice you didn't vote. If you had any reason at all for not voting, like I was sick, my child was sick, something like that, you put that on a little form, send it back, and you're not fined. If you are fined, the fine is 20 Australian dollars, which is $15 American. Australians are very accustomed to this. They know it's coming. And we propose a system very much like that. Only 13% of people end up paying a fine, of non-voters end up paying the fines. That's like about 1% of everybody. So it's the whole point of the system, and the whole point of what we want to do is not to punish. It's not a hammer. It's not a shove. It's just a nudge. This being America, we have some special libertarian components to the system we propose. We think that if you really are opposed to participating in the system, you could apply for conscientious objector status and just keep yourself out of the whole thing. If you don't want to pay the fine, you could do an hour of community service. We are very concerned about what has come to be known as the Ferguson problem. Low-income people, particularly people of color, having fines and penalties piled up on them, interest grows, and then they become criminal. Under our system, it's a flat $20, no at most, no penalties, no interest. And a lot of people ask us, why do you require it? This is America, why don't you offer incentives? We are actually very sympathetic to the idea that Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has been talking about the possibility of a tax credit, for a refundable tax credit, so it goes to everybody, for everyone who registers to vote. So a $50 or $100 tax credit, if you register to vote. So in that case, the fine wouldn't even be out of your pocket. It would just be out of the credit you already got. Essentially, you didn't finish the job and vote, so you got to give $20 back. In Australia, this creates a system where everybody turns out. Elections are on a Saturday. We're not tied to Saturday as the day, although we do think Election Day should be a holiday. And as I said, they're like a party. Australians are famous at their polling places, and you can vote early in Australia. They make it very, very easy to vote no matter where you are in the country. Because everybody knows everybody in the community is going to be out, you can get the most extraordinary range of good food at your polling place. You know, in Georgia, they don't want you to give water to people. In Australia, they give you a whole feast. Because civic groups, school groups, everybody shows up to raise money for their cause by selling various good things to eat. They are especially famous for what are called democracy sausages. There are sausage sizzles at all of the polling places. The Board of Elections in Australia has a sense of humor, and they actually put out a formal-looking note saying the onion officially goes on top of the democracy sausage. But for those of you who have any problem with sausages, Miles and I, in our book, call for vegan alternatives when we go to do this in the United States. I'm going to kick it over to Miles. What I just want to close with is, if you love the idea of Election Day as a feast, then the only problem with our idea is that you might gain a little bit of weight on Election Day, and we think that's okay because you'd be strengthening democracy. And now I kick it over to Miles. Thank you.
Thank you, E.J. I actually want to talk seriously in a minute about how I came over a long period of time to the idea that universal voting was an answer, not the only answer, but an answer to what ails American democracy. But a couple of things first. One, I want to thank E.J. He has been an incredible, incredible partner in this. I know E.J. has been here before, but he has been throughout, not just in writing the book, but prior to that, in all of the research work that we created a working group that was a joint Brookings Institution Ash Center working group that he and I co-chaired. You know, he has been dedicated to this. He has moved it. He has given his credibility to it. He's given his reputation to it, and just an enormous, enormous amount of work. And in addition to that, he's just a real sweetheart of a guy. So, E.J., thank you for being that. And obviously, I want to thank Pastor Tim and the Westminster Town Hall Forum and this beautiful, beautiful location. So I feel very privileged to be here and to be part of it. When I was in the Connecticut State Legislature, we had something that was called a point of personal privilege, where you could sort of put the topic of the day aside and just recognize a few people. Like if your mother came to the legislature, you'd do that. So I want to recognize 3 people. First, I want to recognize Cecily Hines. She has been a critical part of all of this work from the very beginning, has been our Sherpa for the Minnesota trip, but also worked with the working group, et cetera. So, Cecily, thank you for everything that you've done. And I want to recognize Mary Hartnett, who's a very, very old friend of mine. Has been the head of the Commission on Deaf and Hearing Impaired for the state of Minnesota, now does lobbying work for campaign finance reform and other things. So, Mary, I'm delighted to see you here tonight. So thank you for coming. And lastly, I would be totally remiss if I didn't recognize the legendary former Secretary of the State for the state of Minnesota, Joan Grow. Joan and I overlapped. When I became Secretary of the State, she was just leaving, but everybody in that whole community knew and loved Joan, so I was delighted to see you come here today. All right, and secondly, I want to tell a story apropos of what he just said. This is a real story. So I ran in 11 campaigns for Secretary of the State, for state legislature, primaries and generals, for Secretary of the State, and then a race for Congress. And I hated raising money, but I did it because that's what you have to do in campaigns. But I loved going out and knocking on doors. But what was really interesting was you couldn't just go out and knock on doors in a neighborhood. I would get from my campaign people a list. And the list had 2 parts to it. One was, here are the registered voters. And then there would be highlighted in yellow people who were considered at that time prime voters, and these are the people who would go up. And so before I went out door knocking, my campaign people would say to me, you only want to talk to the people who are highlighted. Everybody else cannot help you. Everybody says now that the time of the candidate is the most important resource of a campaign. And they basically said, if you see people and they're sitting on their stoop and they really look like they want to talk to you, but they're not on the list, as Dionne Warwick said, walk on by, and don't talk to them. And it was a terrible. The incentive system in the current campaigns, as EJ was describing, is just awful.
Now, I always interrupt Miles when he tells this story. I always interrupt him because you've gotten to know Miles really well. And anybody who knows Miles knows that he absolutely would not walk by those people even if they weren't registered to vote. And so my image is campaign aides had to drag him away from those voters. But just so you can believe everything else Miles says, I just don't believe that of Miles. Go on, Miles. Go ahead.
All right. All right, but let me now be serious about how I came to the idea of universal voting as such an important public policy. I have been working, if I go back to being in the state legislature where I was the chair of the Elections Commission and Secretary of the State and president of Demos for 13 years and president of Common Cause for 3 years. I basically have been working on voting rights issues, democracy issues, campaign finance reform, gerrymandering and redistricting, the Electoral College, for almost 40 years. And I've worked on all of those reforms. By the way, the first bill I introduced in Connecticut when I got to the legislature in 1985 was for same-day voter registration. And at that time, Minnesota was one of the only, I think one of 6 states, period, that actually had same-day registration. By the way, now there are 23 states. So this has made real progress, and Minnesota was definitely the kind of avatar of this policy. So I've worked on all those issues: same-day registration, universal registration, automatic registration of motor vehicles, restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, expanded mail-in voting, expanded early voting. Just there's a whole suite of policies, and I believe in them thoroughly, and I'm proud to have worked on them for so many years. But I took a look about 5 years ago, and I said, all right, we've done all this work, and of course, there are people in this country who are doing their absolute darndest to roll it all back. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Those people need to be fought and they need to be defeated. But even in the places where we've made this progress, we've moved the needle, but not very much. The 2018 midterm turnout was the highest in the country's history at 50.3%. The 2020 presidential election was the highest in the country, depending on how you count the denominator, it's a little bit, but at 66.2%. So I'm glad that these were record-breaking things, but those are not exactly statistics that you would want to write home to your parents about. It's really a half-baked accomplishment. So I said, all right, is there something that could really move the needle, genuinely move the needle, not from 55% to 60%, but maybe to 90%? And at that time, I read a piece that E.J. Dionne had written with his colleague at the Brookings Institution, William Galston, that basically made the case that universal voting along the model of what they do in Australia, and by the way, 26 other democratic countries around the world. This is not something that is brand new in many places, although there has not been any discussion about it here. So I said, wow. I said 2 things. I said, wow, this is really interesting. This is really worth learning about. This is really worth seeing if I want to really work at it. And secondly, how is it possible that an idea that had proof of concept for 100 years in Australia, as EJ said, I have never been in a discussion of this issue in the United States in the 40 years that I've been working on voting rights issues. How is it possible that we refuse to learn from other places and take on good policies that have been proven to work? And nobody thinks Australia is a totalitarian country as a result of requiring people to vote. So we put together this working group. We studied it for 2 years. We put out a report that was called Lift Every Voice, the urgency of universal civic duty voting. That was in 2020 in the middle of COVID. And we got a call. Got a lot of calls, but among the calls was the publisher of the New Press, who said, I'm a fervent believer in this. The New Press, by the way, is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit, wonderful publisher. And Diane Wachtel, the executive director of it, called and said, I've been wanting somebody to do a book for 5 years on this subject. Would you, Miles, be willing to do it? So I said, yes, I would love to do it, but I've sort of got this sidekick that I've been working with, and I don't want him to feel left out. Would it be okay with you if E.J. Dionne co-authored the book with me? And she said something along the lines of, twist my bleeping arm. And so that's how E.J. and I came to write this book together. But just to hone down, I think that there are 4 major benefits to this. I mean, I think there would be more, but let me just say the 4. 1, immediately turnout would go from 60% to 90%, and that would be a much fuller electorate, a much more participatory electorate for the country. Number 2, that electorate would be far more fully reflective of the population as a whole. And we've talked about the analogy of jury duty, but the reason you have required jury service is because you want the jury pool, writ large, to reflect the population of the country as a whole. You want all of the people, a truly representative sample of all the people to be deciding on people's guilt or innocence and the appropriate punishment. I think the same thing applies 100% to the act of voting. We want, or we certainly should want, everybody to be participating, and the decisions that come out of the voting process about the laws that are going to affect our daily lives and the people who are going to make those laws should be made by a fully reflective pool. 2 other quick things, then I'll throw it back to EJ. The third thing is, I think that if you really were moving towards universal voting, the institutions of society would bend themselves towards making it possible and easy and convenient for people to vote. So, for instance, to vote in an informed way. So if I were the principal of a high school and I knew that every single graduating senior was going to have to vote when they turn 18, would I be more likely to make civic education a more important part of the curriculum? I think I would. If I were an employer and I knew that every single one of my employees were required by law to vote, would I be more likely to give them the time off to do that and to participate? I think I would. And on and on. If I were an election official and it was the law of the land, whether in the state or the federal or in a municipality or in Minneapolis or in St. Paul, that this was a required act for every citizen, would I make it my business to make it possible for them to do that? I think I really would. So I think that the institutions of society would bend themselves towards making this really work. And the last thing is that the campaigns would change. EJ made the point about the dinner party, but right now, you know, it's all about turnout. If any of you know any Democratic consultants or Republican consultants, they're saying right now, for the 2022 elections, this is not a persuasion election. This is a turnout election. If we can get our people to vote, and parenthetically, in the worst case scenario, we can get their people not to vote, then we win. Great idea, except it cheapens the way in which we run campaigns. The incentive system is horrible. If you had a situation where every single person were voting, and therefore every single person were listening all of the time, the campaigns would need to change. Instead of just enraging to engage, instead of just trying to depress the vote, they'd have to talk to everybody. They'd have to persuade everybody that their policies were better. I think that would be really, really healthy. Will this solve all the problems of our democracy? No. And we'll probably come back to that. But I think this, in the lane of full participation, I think this is a huge, huge important thing. And what we're trying to do is put a North Star reform out there, not thinking that it's going to become law super quickly, but at least it becomes part of the public debate. And that's the point of writing the book.
So we're going to do one more lightning round for you because Miles and I have been doing a lot of events on this, and we've gotten a lot of good questions, including some like, are you serious about this? Do you think this can happen? Kinds of questions. So I'm going to deal with 2 issues. One is the constitutionality of it, and the other is the fact that this would not tilt the election system in a partisan way. And then Miles will close by saying how we propose to bring this about at various levels of government. We worked on our working group with a spectacular group of lawyers, including Cecily. And one of the chapters in the book I'm proudest of is the chapter we had the least to do with, which is our legal chapter, which we got in large part from our lawyers. You might ask the question, because we've never done this before in the United States, and because anytime you propose anything serious in this country, you're going to be sued and you know it. And so we really tried to think through, and the lawyers we worked with tried to think through what would this look like in court. Now, I will not for an instant predict how the current Supreme Court will rule on anything, but what our lawyers discovered is that there are two streams of cases. One set of cases suggests that the government cannot force you to speak. Compelled speech is a problem. We saw that, for example, in the Pledge of Allegiance cases involving Amish children. You can't be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance in school. If you force somebody to go to the polls and actually vote for a candidate when they didn't want to vote for any of the candidates on the ballot, that might be fairly construed as compelled speech. But if you look at the Australian system and the system we propose, this is a participation requirement, not a speech requirement. In Australia, you are free to cast a blank ballot. You are free to write all sorts of nasty messages on your ballot. You are free to crumple up your ballot. What you are asked to do is participate in the election, and you can abstain in effect if you want to. The same would be true in our system. The kinds of compulsion that the government can engage in, as Miles suggested, is the best example of that is jury duty, where in the interests of justice, everyone is required at least to offer themselves when they are called to serve on juries. If you made voting easier, and we can both talk about all the reforms we think of as gateway reforms to make voting as easy as possible, because that's the whole point of our idea. We believe that declaring voting as a legal and civic duty is the best way to defend it as a right. So we do that with jury duty, and there are other requirements. Parents are required to send their kids to school till they're 16 years old, or if they homeschool, to homeschool them according to certain standards. That's a big requirement on people in the country. If you make voting easy, which we propose to do, it's not a terribly burdensome requirement. And just to be absolutely clear that you would not be forced to vote for a candidate you don't like, we would propose that all ballots have a none of the above option. And so, which they have in Nevada and they have it in Arizona, you could just check none of the above. So no compelled speech here. And that's why we are convinced, and our lawyers are convinced, that this could be successfully defended in court. Miles and I are both broadly on the progressive side of politics, and so people fairly ask us, are you just trying to gin the electorate and fix it so your side will win every election? We're not for this because we are trying to fix an election, the election results. Indeed, we were talking to a prominent politician here today in Minnesota who said one of the hardest things to get across to people is high turnout does not automatically elect Democrats. And in fact, in the book, we offer the example of what happened in the 2020 election. When there was very record turnout for us as a country, as Miles said, depending on what denominator you use, but really extraordinary increases in turnout. And yet people said, gee, but Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by 7 million votes nationwide, but the Republicans picked up all these House seats. How did that happen? Well, it happened because between 2018 and 2020, there was a big turnout increase in Donald Trump's constituency. The turnout for Trump voters was made easier, just like it was made for Biden voters, by all of the changes we made in the system to make it easier for people to vote. I always say I was very proud I cast my mail ballot in a drop box in front of Walt Whitman High School in Bethesda, Maryland, which I love for two reasons. One is that's where our three kids went to high school, but two, Walt Whitman is the poet of American democracy, so I felt it was a poetic act as I dropped that ballot in. But those systems weren't biased toward any party. They were open to everyone. And probably the single best example is in Virginia in 2021, where the Democrats, when they were in power in the state, made voting easier than it ever was. They produced a system that created an extremely high turnout in 2021, and Republicans won all three statewide offices in Virginia. So we think this system is good not because our candidates will always win. We think this system is good because we are consulting the broadest possible group of Americans. The concept of crowdsourcing is very popular now, and we all know that when you crowdsource with a bigger group, you are likely to get a better answer. Democracy, after all, is the hunch that most of the people are right most of the time. I've always liked that kind of humble definition of democracy. We're not always collectively right all the time, but we put our faith in the system because most of the time, consulting as many of us as possible produces a rational result and helps us protect liberty. And so we're for this because we want a stronger democracy and we want a more inclusive democracy. And Miles will now tell you how we're going to pull this thing off. Go ahead, Miles.
Well, in the book, which I'm now told all of you are going to buy, this is great. In addition to all kinds of interesting factoids, and the list of all the countries where
real
this take
facts,
place.
you know.
Real facts, yeah. We also talk about how and at what level this universal voting might be implemented. So it obviously could happen at the federal level. That is, Congress could decide that universal voting, that requiring everyone to vote, was a federal law, and they certainly could do that. We haven't expected that they will do that, given the current situation, although there's an asterisk on that. But the second
You're going to tell them about the asterisk.
I'm going to, yeah. The second level is the state level. You know, there's absolutely clear that state legislatures can, for state elections and for congressional elections, set the terms and conditions of the elections in the state. So we are very hopeful and that some states, starting maybe next year, will at least begin to discuss this idea at the state level. And then the third level is the municipal level. There's no question that states can do it. There's a little more complication in trying to think about whether municipalities can do it because constitutionally, municipalities are generally considered, quote, creatures of the state. So there might be enabling legislation or home rule legislation or various things. And it's different in different states. So the people who are in a state kind of working on this issue would have to really try to figure out, what the possibilities were. But I think
our book tells you which 13 states you can do this in right now in a municipality.
And then, so that's number one. Here's the asterisk. The asterisk is that, EJ and I were on Morning Joe about 3 weeks ago. We had a really good discussion and segment. Reverend Al Sharpton was on with us. We had no idea he was going to be there. We had no idea what he was going to say, but he came out 100% for universal voting. He said voting should be a civic obligation of every citizen. So, we see support building already. But a congressman from Connecticut named John Larson saw the segment, bought the book, and decided he really, really supports it, and he actually submitted legislation. So there now is a federal bill, H.R. 7536, which is entitled the Civic Duty to Vote Act, that has been filed. They're working on the title, and they're going to try to get a bunch of original co-sponsors, so it's sort of in flux. But the fact is that we did not in any way expect that there would be a federal bill this quickly in the process, and we'll obviously follow it along. But our fundamental next step is to believe that, that the book is great. We do think that the book has been a great way to begin to get the idea out into the public discussion. But anything that you're going to win on, even over time, requires organizing. And so our plan is to create a new initiative called the 100% Democracy Initiative, which will, do ongoing research about the issue, continuing communications to get the word out, and organizing in localities to see whether we can move it legislatively, either in next year or beginning next year. I think our strategy sort of is threefold. One is to continue to move it out in the kind of intellectual debate or journalism debate or policy debate or academic debate, where people are genuinely discussing policy, and to have this, again, be a real part of the discussion, which I think is actually already happening at least a lot more than it was when I first heard about this. Secondly, there is, in my view, a robust and growing democracy movement. There are organizations who are working on campaign finance issues, on voting rights issues, on litigation, on the Electoral College, all these things. But to try to get this idea, this kind of North Star idea of universal voting, to be part of the agenda of that movement. Not in place of everything else they're doing. There are other things that are really, really important, but as one of the things that become part of the agenda. And then thirdly, to try to get it actually taken up in policy ways in legislatures and in municipalities, et cetera. And this is a kind of 3 to 4 year plan that we're going to start working on. It's going to start in July. Hopefully we'll be able to come back and talk with some of you in Minnesota here. But that's our hope, that, in other words, that the book doesn't just end as being a book, but that it is the spark for a real discussion in the country and real policy change after that. So that's our hope. That's why we write the book, and that's why we're delighted to be here with you tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, E.J. Dionne and Miles Rapoport. This is the Westminster Town Hall Forum, coming to you from Westminster Presbyterian Church on Nicollet Mall in beautiful downtown Minneapolis. I'm Tim Hart Anderson, the senior minister here at Westminster Church and moderator of the forum. Our speakers this evening are E.J. Dionne and Miles Rapoport. While the ushers collect questions from the in-house audience, I'd like to thank our co-sponsor for this program, the Minnesota Humanities Center. Learn more about their important work to build civic capacity and promote civic renewal through the humanities at mnhum.org, mnhum.org. I'd also like to thank our media partners, MinnPost, which you can find online at minnpost.com, as well Sahan Journal, finding their coverage at sahanjournal.com. And thanks also to Minnesota Public Radio for recording and broadcasting all Westminster Town Hall Forums. I'd also invite you to mark your calendar for our next Town Hall Forum in just 2 weeks, Tuesday, May 24th at 6 p.m. Journalists Michelle Norris and Yamiche Alcindor will speak on what has changed in America in the 2 years since the murder of George Floyd. Please join us for our second annual Arc Toward Justice program in partnership with the Minneapolis Foundation, Tuesday, May 24th, 6 p.m. And now, if our speakers are ready, I will present the questions from the audience. First question has to do with analyzing the problems with American democracy. Both of you alluded to the problems, and this being one of them. What are the problems today, in your view, with American democracy?
What?
And we only have a few minutes. Okay?
Yeah. There's a great story about a journalist sent out to cover God giving Moses the 10 Commandments.
This is a good story. I'm liking it.
Yeah, and, he gets back to his producer, and the producer says, look, we only got 1:20 for this story. Can you tell us just report the 2 most important commandments? Which I've always thought is a brilliant thing to preach on. So the problems with American democracy, let me just focus on the aspect that most directly relates to what we're talking about here today. In our book, we really celebrate what happened in 2000, and it really was a miracle in our country. When the pandemic hit, we were asking ourselves, how in the world are we going to have an election when people might have to risk their lives to cast their ballots. There are people who have risked and lost their lives to defend our democracy, but this would mean everyday citizens, if they flock to the polls as normal, could actually spread a dread disease and get very ill themselves. And we talk about the Wisconsin primary, which was held in this circumstance, and it was just a terrible idea to hold a normal election in the middle of a pandemic. But we're an inventive country. And what did we do all over the country, in Republican areas as well as Democratic areas? Election officials, in some cases state legislatures, said, we got to change the laws. We got to make it easier and our systems. We got to make it easier for people to vote by mail. We've got to make it easier. People shouldn't need excuses to cast absentee ballots. We should set up drop boxes. We should do all kinds of things so that people can safely cast their ballots. And so the crowds at the polls on Election Day would be smaller and the lines would be shorter. And that's exactly what we did. So what has happened since? What's happened since is that we become two nations when it comes to democracy. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, 25 states have actually built on the voter expansions of 2000 to make it easier still for people to exercise their right to vote. But 19 states have actually pulled back on the accommodations made to make it easier to vote. And so you have a situation in which various forms of voter suppression are reasserting themselves and really disenfranchising pieces of the electorate. Our whole system makes it harder on young people to vote already because unlike older people, younger people move around a lot. And unless you have Election Day registration, as your great state does, many young people, when they finally find out they want to vote, they discover the deadline is passed and they can't change their registration. This goes back to an earlier round of voter suppression. My favorite form of voter suppression was in Texas, where when they created an ID law, and you could use your concealed carry permit, but students at the state university could not use their publicly issued student IDs to vote. Now, I wonder what was going on there. I thought that maybe the Democrats were going to run an Arm All the Democrats campaign in Texas. But that's the sort of thing that's going on. I think there are many other problems with our democracy, but just at the most basic level of voting, instead of embracing success and building on it, we're splitting on whether we should do that, and that's a really unfortunate thing.
Let me make just two other points. One, I alluded to the fact earlier that there are a lot of things that are wrong with American democracy that are not, in the wheelhouse of universal voting. So, the money in politics issue. We have a system in which huge donors, and it's getting worse and worse. We have a few billionaires who are, having unbelievably outsized influence on campaigns. That needs to be fixed. The Electoral College itself is a huge and undemocratic institution that is baked into the Constitution, but it can be reformed. There are things that can be done. The undemocratic nature of the United States Senate, where you have people, where 70 million people in California have the same 2 senators as 350,000 people in Wyoming. And so, there are a lot of things that really need to be addressed that this doesn't address. So I think that we need to be honest about that. We're not kind of making the case that this is solving all the problems. And the second thing I would say is that we are in a moment of real crisis. And I think that, the fact that EJ and I are optimistic by nature and that we really believe that we ought to be thinking about what it is, the kind of democracy that we want, we also realize that we're in a fight to protect what we have. There is a group of people, and it's not everybody in the Republican Party. EJ made the point, but I want to make it as a former Secretary of State. There are Secretaries of State, Republican Secretaries of State around the country who are doing a really, really good job, but there are certainly some people who are seeking to enshrine minority rule by any means necessary. And those people have to be fought in every way possible. So that fight is going on. But I also think that we have to also not stop thinking about what we'd like to see in the future.
You say this is not a partisan issue, If so, if it's such a good idea, who are the Republican proponents of this idea who are joining you with this plan? Can you name some? Here comes the book.
Yeah, I joke that Miles and I are either the most honest book writers ever or the dumbest, because we actually did polling that shows that as of right now, most Americans reject our idea. We did with the Democracy Fund, we did polling in February of 2020, where we found that 26% of Americans supported this idea, 10% were undecided, the rest were opposed. 48% were strongly opposed. I looked at those numbers and said, that's actually not bad for an idea that is said to run against our libertarian grain and that no one has ever systematically argued for. I thought starting with 26% is pretty good. And if you took together everyone who was not strongly opposed, about half the country was willing to support it. But one of the most interesting and heartening things is that Republicans and Democrats, and I grant you, we did that polling before all of the election denial activity, I'll be polite, of President Trump. It's possible opinion among Republicans has moved. But when we did our poll, we discovered that Republicans were almost as sympathetic, or the views between Republicans and Democrats weren't all that different. That 33% of Democrats, but 29% of Republicans supported the idea. There are actually more doubts among independents than there were among Republicans or Democrats. The other thing we found out is that on our core principle of voting as both a right and a duty, a large majority of Americans in both parties sees voting not just as a right, but as a right and a duty. 69% of Democrats and 69% of Republicans both said that voting was a right and a duty. And so we haven't had massive endorsement of the idea from politicians yet, but we are working very hard to get people on both sides. My notion of an experiment, I'd love to see, say, the state of Utah and the state of Vermont try our idea. One, a very Republican state, but that's been open to high participation. One, a very Democratic state that's also open to high participation. Smaller states, so it's easy to conduct an experiment. I'd love to see both of them a pairing like that to see what would happen.
I have to say I chafe a little bit when the two of you use the word "our" in front of idea. The women's movement for vote the suffragette movement was a movement for spreading the franchise to women, to everybody. The movement among African Americans, civil rights movement, that was a movement for spreading the franchise to everybody. Is this really a unique idea you have, or is it not just a continuation of other ideas of expanding the access to vote?
Forgive me, we're using "our" because we're talking about an idea in our book. That's the only sense in which the word "our" is being used by us. In fact, one of the arguments we made as we talked about this is that the history of the United States is a history of expanding our democracy with some moments of contraction, like after Reconstruction. Yeah. When we started, the franchise was for white men who were property owners. And then it was expanded to include all white men. Then it was expanded briefly to include black Americans after the Civil War. That was pushed back by Jim Crow. Then we finally started expanding the vote to women, which, by the way, began in the States, in Wyoming in 1890, before it became a national idea. So we see our idea, as we express it in the book, as very much in the trajectory of our country's history. And our country is all of us.
One of the problems you didn't enumerate about our current political system is the role of money, campaign finance. How would your idea, this idea, change that, if at all, the role of money spent in elections?
Two things. One, as Miles said, we've been very careful not to be like those 19th century guys, they were usually guys, with little vials saying we got this elixir that'll cure all that ails you. You know, we are not claiming this idea cures all that ails us. And we have a chapter in the book on the things we think are wrong with the system. My own view, and I think Miles agrees with this, is that I would like to see, and because I think this could pass constitutional muster, I'm a very, very, very vocal critic of Citizens United. And I think that the combination, when you think about gutting the Voting Rights Act on the one side and empowering really rich people on the other side, that sure sounds like oligarchy to me. And so I dislike both those decisions. But even under the terms of Citizens United, you could set up a system, as some states have, of matching smaller donors to kind of shift the system to create strong incentives for candidates to raise small money, like a 7-to-1 match for all $100 or less, contributions of $100 or less. That was actually in the original For the People Act, a system like that. I think democratizing money is a very important piece of democratizing our country.
You know, let me add just quickly, which is that as you know, I'm from Connecticut, and Connecticut actually has a strong and successful system of public financing for state campaigns. It was enacted about 15 years ago. What candidates and Republicans and Democrats like it and run on the system. You collect a certain amount of money in small donations with some geographic spread, and once you do that, you get a grant from the state that is sufficient not to do a wild and crazy campaign, but sufficient to do a good campaign, provided that you stop raising money. And what I have heard from candidates in Connecticut, I actually did a report on this maybe 10 years ago, was that they considered it a breath of fresh air, that they're not spending their time talking to donors or dialing for dollars. You know, they would put me in a dark room with a bag of potato chips and a bottle of Diet Coke, and that would be my night, calling strangers I didn't know and asking them for money.
I'm so grateful you're still standing there, Miles.
Yeah.
You know?
I will say this. I'm sorry, but this is a good story. So I got a list. It was from another Connecticut congressman's 500 and up donors, and I was calling them. And a lot of them were auto dealers, and a lot of them were this. So I'm calling them up, and they're all giving me the same thing, which is taxes are too high, environmental regulations are too strict, government is bothering us and leaving them alone. Now, I'm sitting there thinking, I don't agree with anything you say, but I'm also thinking, my point here is not to persuade you. My point here is to get the check. So gradually, I started to develop lines like, well, that's really interesting. I'm not sure I agree with it, but if you give me money and if I'm elected, I guarantee you can come down to Washington and we'll talk about it, And I'm thinking, I got a pretty strong backbone on these things, but I'm figuring out ways to twist it and bend it in order to get the money. And I think that happens every day, 100, 1,000 times a day in our political system, and it is disgraceful.
This has been a fascinating conversation. We're grateful to the Minnesota Humanities Center for making it possible as a co-sponsor. In 30 seconds, are you two hopeful, as our final question, hopeful about American democracy?
I'm always hopeful about American democracy because I love the Winston Churchill line that it's ascribed to Churchill, that Americans always do the right thing after first exhausting all of the other possibilities. And we've come around a few times. The other reason I'm hopeful for the idea we're putting forward here today, you may wonder, will the United States ever do this? Isn't this a radical idea? I want you to think about the following, that we all take for granted that we vote by secret ballot. We think that's the way it's always been done, right? But it's not the way it's always been done. The secret ballot was another idea we got from Australia. The secret ballot used to be known, when it was adopted here, was known as the Australian ballot. And it was fought over fiercely. Political machines didn't like it because, when you bought the vote, when the ballot was open, you knew you got what you paid for. But over a period of time, and Jill Lepore, the great historian, wrote a great piece on this in the New Yorker, in the late 19th century to the early 20th century, state after state adopted it. And now we wouldn't think of voting any other way than by secret ballot. We hope that our reform will get adopted in enough places that people will ask, why didn't we do this before? Will ask themselves not why, but why not try this? Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
E.J. Dionne, Miles Rapoport, thank you very much for stimulating a lot of thought here tonight. And books can be purchased out here on your way to Breads and Spreads in Westminster Hall.
Prove my friend David Brooks right. That would be very nice. Thank you.
Thank you all, and we'll see you at the next Town Hall Forum in 2 weeks, the 24th. Take care. Sorry to get at you on that hour thing, but it's been going around American history for a long time. Movements to expand the franchise, which is
No, but the hour was particularly, I understand.
But what you wanted was the sense of this has been a history.
Yeah, no, so no, you gave me, I like doing that riff, so you gave me an opening to do that.
yeah, least I could do for you.
What?
So,
Say again?
so it was the least I could do for you, right? Nicely done, you guys.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was
We really,
fun.
really enjoyed it.
And we'll see
Hello,
you
Jim.
again, I suspect.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Can I have my book back?
Oh, yes, you may.
This is the reason I